Hello there! I'm the Craft Maiden, and in this video I will show you how I made a precious Portkey portmanteau from the game Harry Potter Wizards Unite. To start things off, I used photos from the game to make a template, and to check if the proportions were somewhat right I also made a cardboard mock-up before I started the real thing. For this project I'm using Plasticard, and if you want to know more about that and all the other materials and tools I use in this video, you can find a list of it down below in the description box. After cutting out the 5 sides of the pentagon box, it was time to make the top and bottom and make it fit inside them. And since the template I made is as wide as the sides, I needed to remove the thickness of it all around before cutting it out in Plasticard. To save some material, I made the bottom part out of scrap pieces. Before assembling the box, I filed down the edges that were supposed to be connected at an angle. Then I glued on 2 support rods, one at the top and one at the bottom. And when they dried, I filed the rods at an angle as well. Since I needed access to the inside later on, I only glued on the sides onto the bottom piece, and to give support to the joints I added a round rod to the corners. When the base of the box was done, I glued on a piece of rod all around the bottom of it. To make the border all around, I used thin strips of Plasticard, marked out where the rod's supposed to start, cut it into an angle, and glued it on. And to make the rod flush against the edge of the strip, I used an angle tool just to flatten it out a bit. Then I glued it onto the base and filed or cut off any excess. Then I repeated the same thing for the top border, but used a thicker rod as it's wider than the bottom one. To make everything look seamless when painted, I used model filler to hide all the gaps. To sand the filler, I wanted to use something that wouldn't leave any hard scratches on the surface, so I ended up using a buffing tool for nails, but any soft sanding tool should work fine. After removing all the dust, I used the same sized strips to make the vertical bars. And since the bars are supposed to be thinner than the smaller border, I used thinner rods to fill them out. To make it easy, I also used the same strip as a measure to place the bar from the edge. And to place the third one right, I marked out the middle on both the box and the bar before gluing it on. When all the bars were glued into place, I cut out the lock part and used paper glue to stick it onto the Plasticard. And if you're wondering, most paper glues are easily dissolved in water and therefore easy to remove later on. As it's a bit difficult to use a scalpel and cut all around the keyhole, I used a model drill instead. To get the key in the right size, I use the keyhole as a reference. There is an indent in the key that were too difficult to carve out, so I removed the top to make it a lot easier. And when the indents were done, I glued on the top part again. Sometimes I didn't have the right thickness of the card, so I had to double them up and glue it together to get it right. To make this part of the key sturdy enough, I made a core out of twisted wire. I used Super Scalpel for this part, and I decided to make it in 3 steps. The first step is just making a rough shape of it and bake it before adding the details. The second step was to add the details on one side using liquid Fimo to adhere the new clay and using clay softener to remove all the fingerprints before baking it. And the third and final step is to repeat step 2 but on the other side. So by baking the clay in between each step, I minimize the risk of misshaping and destroying finished details. To stick 2 pieces of already baked clay together, I use super glue. The tip of the key is rounded, so by gluing a piece of wire inside the plastic bead, it will hold much better when glued into place. And to assemble everything, I used hot glue. As many of you might know, this kind of videos takes me a really long time to complete, so if you would like to, you can support me on Patreon. I have a link up in the corner and down below in the description box as well, so if it's something you would like to do, it would really mean a lot to me. And now, back to finishing the lock. I used a thicker piece of Plasticard for the rim. By making guidelines to where to place the lock, I could see where I needed to fill it out, since the top border is a lot wider than the bottom one. When the bottom of the lock was done, I used the thicker border as a guide and cut out smaller pieces that I glued on. When gluing the pieces on, I let them stick out a bit from the edge. And to give the border a bit more support, I also added rods in between each joint. So because the pieces are sticking out, it's much easier to file it down and make it smooth and round. And to make the border look even more seamless, I used model filler again. I experimented a bit to create a mechanism that would allow me to turn the key in the lock, and I'll try to explain it as good as possible, otherwise I hope you can see what I have done. Except for the shape it's cut, I also added 2 pieces inside, one to keep the inner movable tube in the center and the other one as a stop so it doesn't come out with the key. And for the inner movable tube I also added some bits, but on the outside, both as distance and stop. And to keep the key from drooping, I also added a small piece, as the key is kind of heavy at the other end. And the last piece is this little thing, just to keep the other end of the inner tube from falling out and staying centered. Before gluing everything together, I also painted the inside black, as it might show up white or reflect the light from the keyhole. As the bottom of the box is open, I decided to make a housing for the lock, so no light would show up from there. And now for the top of the box. Before gluing it on, I marked out where and how big the upraised part should be placed. So with this guideline that my phone almost won't pick up, I used masking tape to make a template. Before gluing the upraised part on, I added the top first so that I could fill in the gaps with model filler and sand it smooth. And before finally gluing on the upraised part, I sanded and smoothed out the edges as well. Since the portmanteau have 5 feet, I decided to start with making one out of clay. And to make things easier, I made it in 3 steps, starting off with the base. Then I used clay softener to remove all the fingerprints before baking it. After it had cooled down, I added liquid Fimo to adhere the new clay. And as before, I used clay softener to remove every fingerprint before baking it. And once again, when it had cooled down, I added liquid Fimo to adhere the new clay. Apparently I didn't film when finishing this piece and using clay softener to remove all the fingerprints before baking it one last time. Since it's kind of hard to sculpt 5 identical feet, I made a mold out of this one. If you want to know more in detail how I cast silicone molds, I recommend you watching my Casting a Pumpkin DIY for more details step by step. I think I saw this in one of Adam Savage's videos where they cut halfway through a silicone piece in a zigzag pattern to create keys and the other in a half in a straight line to get a nice and straight seam on the objects. To cast the feet I used resin TRD50 Excellence, but you can use whichever resin you have at hand. Just remember to wear protective gears when using stuff like this. I mixed together equal parts of A and B, and then I added a few drops of black pigment to get a nice base color. Then I poured it all into the mold, shaking it to release some air bubbles, and then I waited for it to cure. If you remove the feet a bit early and it hasn't really hardened all the way through, it will be much easier to remove the excess. So after making 5 of those feet, I glued them on with hot glue. And that's it for the base of the box. Now it's time for the lid. For this part I used a thicker piece of Plasticard as I wanted to deboss the pattern into it. First I tried to use my engraver, but after making them all I wasn't really satisfied with the depth, so I used one of these carving tools instead to make the pattern more visible. So if you are making this yourself, you can always use a scalpel to trace the pattern and then remove the paper and carve it. And to deboss the holes I used 2 different sizes of diamond carving tools with my Dremel. And to get rid of any accidents, I used model filler and the buffing tool. Then I realized, because I have to add a frame all around, I kind of have to remove the thickness of the frame from the edges. So in this case I removed 1 mm from the 2 longer sides of each triangle. After that I filed the same sides at an angle before gluing them all together using regular clear tape to keep them all in place. And to make sure it dries in the right shape, I placed it onto the box and used rods to keep it tight so that the frame would fit later on. For the frames I used a thinner Plasticard, and here I added a bit more material to the edges just to be safe. To be able to place the frame right on the lid later on, I marked out the line on the frame that connects to the line on the lid. I also marked out where I had to carve a bit more. Then I filed and sanded the edges smooth. After that I cut out all the smaller pieces and used the cutouts to save some material. I also added a bit more material to the edges in case I needed more later on. I used masking tape to protect the lid from unwanted glue. Using the line on the lid as a guideline, I glued on the frame one by one. Until it had all dried, I secured it with more masking tape. When it finally dried, I removed the tape and used some more to protect the frame on the other side while I filed off the excess. For the other side of the frame that wasn't really connected to anything yet, I just cut off the excess and filed it flush to the lid before adding another piece of the frame. When the base of the frame was done, I added all the small pieces. And as with all the rest of this project, I used model filler for a smooth and seamless look. Thanks to the masking tape, it's quite easy to remove the frame from the lid. If there were any parts that really didn't fit together, I used a scalpel and carefully corrected the errors. And to make the bits fit a bit more with the frame, I just filed them. And to really make sure the frame looked seamless, I also used spray filler before gluing it onto the lid. I used model filler to smooth out the crannies between the frame and lid. With a scalpel, I connected all the lines all around the lid. As there's something, my guess is a bird, sitting on the top, I used my model drill and a drill bit, the thickness of the wire I'm going to use for that, to make a hole at the top. So for the bird, I used a template, made a skeleton out of wire and used a glass bead as I needed it to resist heat. And for the wings and tail, I used this metal mesh, usually used for repairing holes in cars, etc. Then I fastened it by using a thinner wire and also added another leg. And to keep it in place, I used liquid Fimo inside the bead and also a piece of Super Scalpel and baked it before adding the rest of the clay. For a bit of texture, I used a piece of crinkled up aluminum foil and used it as a stamp before baking it. Here I have already added one of the wings and already baked it one more time. That is because I don't want to damage the one I already made before making the other one. And as always, I used liquid Fimo to adhere the new clay. After adding the really small feet, I baked it one last time. Then it was finally time to give everything a black base coat, and to avoid getting paint inside the lock and make it stick together, I used tissue paper to fill up the keyhole. When the base coat had dried, I gave the box and the bird a silver coat. And after that dried, I added on a darker silver. Then I added a lighter silver on top of that to brighten it up a bit. I do really like the color of the precious Portkey Portmanteau, so I used a cerulean blue and a black paint and mixed it together to get sort of the right shade. To get a really nice and even coverage of the paint, you might need to add additional layers until it's opaque enough and not streaky anymore. Two layers of the blue later, I mixed in some white in some of the blue paint and dry brushed it on for some depth. On the lid, however, I started heavily with the paint in the middle and dragged it almost all the way out to the edges. For the fourth layer, I added even more white paint to the blue and used the same technique as with the previous layer and leaving the edges. And for the fifth layer, I added even more white paint to the mixture and stippled it on. To make the details show up even more, I used some of the first blue base color and mixed in some black for the straight lines. And for the rest of the debossed motif, I used the blue base color. According to the reference photos, there are a frame of some sort here and the middle part is lighter, so for that I used masking tape to cover the border and used a lighter silver spray. And for the last layer of paint I used a black wash to all the nooks and crannies. I wasn't really happy with the light part, so I scored a line all around and carved it out and painted it. And do any of you by any chance know what's under the shoe? I think it's a logo of some sort, but I haven't figured it out, so if you have any guesses or actually know what it is, please let me know in the comment section. And back to the key. For the next layer of paint I used a gold spray. And since it looked really cool but too flat, I added a black wash. And that's all there is for the key. Now time for the assembly. And really, the only thing left to do is to secure the bird with hot glue and then finish off the painting work inside the lid. And here it is, the finished precious Portkey Portmanteau. Yes, that was by far the longest video I have made up to date, and thanks for everybody that helped me decide to actually make it into one video instead of two. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more awesome stuff, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!